This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Ethan had always been a quiet, thoughtful child, with a curiosity that often led him into corners of the world where others rarely ventured. Born into a middle-class family in a conservative neighborhood of Washington, D.C., Ethan's young life was defined by routines, rules, and expectations. His parents, Susan and Michael, were reserved people who prided themselves on running a disciplined household. They valued tradition, responsibility, and conformity, especially in their children. Ethan, being the youngest of three siblings, was expected to follow the example set by his older brother and sister, both of whom fit comfortably into the family's image of achievement and respectability. From an early age, Ethan sensed that he was different from his siblings. While they were athletic and outgoing, easily blending in with their friends at school and the local community center, Ethan preferred quiet spaces. He would sit for hours drawing or reading, his imagination taking him to worlds far removed from the one he lived in. He loved art, colors, and stories with characters who were kind, who understood each other without needing words. His parents tolerated these quiet activities, viewing them as typical childhood pastimes that he would eventually grow out of. They assumed that, like his siblings, Ethan would soon develop interests in sports, outdoor activities, or the more normal hobbies that fit their view of how a young boy should spend his time. But as Ethan grew, his interests and behaviors diverged more sharply from his family's expectations. He was sensitive, prone to moments of introspection and shyness, and found solace in things that his parents and siblings often dismissed as silly or unimportant. When his mother noticed that he preferred playing with certain toys or spending more time with her than with his father, she became concerned, gently but persistently encouraging him to join his brother in rougher games outside. Ethan tried to follow his family's cues, mimicking his brother's actions in the games he played. But he often found himself retreating when the activities grew too loud, aggressive, or competitive. To him, these things felt foreign, uncomfortable, and even frightening at times. Ethan's father, Michael, grew increasingly frustrated with his youngest son's behavior. A man who valued strength, resilience, and discipline, Michael believed that children needed to learn to toughen up in order to survive in the world. He had instilled these values in Ethan's older siblings, who mirrored his expectations back to him, earning his approval and praise. But with Ethan, things were different. Michael struggled to understand his son's quiet disposition and viewed his sensitivity as a flaw, something that needed to be corrected. He began to voice his disappointment in subtle but unmistakable ways, sometimes through remarks during family dinners or through his cold, dismissive tone when Ethan would seek his attention. Ethan, though young, was perceptive. He sensed the undercurrent of disapproval from his father and tried to alter himself to fit his father's image of a proper son, but the more he tried, the more he realized that he could not change the way he felt inside. His preference for solitude, his need for gentleness, and his love of colors and creativity were intrinsic parts of him that he could not set aside. Each attempt to conform left him feeling lonelier, more distant from his family, and with each failed attempt, his father's disappointment deepened. In school, Ethan's sense of isolation grew. His classmates were quick to notice that he was different from the other boys, a quality that made him an easy target for teasing. Ethan was not as loud or assertive as his peers. He didn't join in on sports, and he tended to stay by himself during recess, drawing on scraps of paper or reading books in the corner of the playground. Some of the other boys began to mock him, picking up on the subtle cues that marked him as an outsider. They would call him names, mimicking his quiet voice and miming his gentle gestures in exaggerated, mocking tones. Each taunt, each mocking laugh, chipped away at the small fragments of confidence he had, leaving him feeling exposed, as though his very nature was something to be ashamed of. At home, the bullying he faced at school was compounded by the cold atmosphere of his family. His siblings, who had no patience for Ethan's quiet nature, joined in the teasing, mimicking the language of the boys at school. His brother, a star athlete, and his sister, who was popular in her own right, viewed Ethan's demeanor as a mark of weakness. To them, he was simply different in a way they could neither understand nor appreciate. They would roll their eyes when he spoke or ignore him entirely, dismissing his interests and making him feel invisible in his own home. Susan, his mother, was more empathetic but also felt constrained by the social expectations around her. Though she sometimes comforted Ethan after particularly harsh encounters, she did so quietly, often brushing it off as just a phase. Her attempts to shield him were half-hearted, hesitant, as though she feared Michael's reaction should he sense any softness toward what he considered Ethan's weakness. To maintain harmony in the household, she would often avoid intervening altogether, turning a blind eye to the taunts and coldness directed at Ethan. Though she felt a pang of guilt, her loyalty to her husband's values, and her desire to maintain a normal family image were stronger. This rejection from his family, combined with the bullying at school, created a deep well of loneliness within Ethan. He began to withdraw into himself, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary, as if his words might betray some hidden part of him that the world found so wrong. At night he would lie in bed, listening to the silence of the house around him, wondering why he was so different and why everything he did seemed to disappoint or upset those he was supposed to love. As the months wore on, Ethan's sense of self became a source of constant shame. He no longer drew pictures or brought home books from the library, and he began to distance himself from the things that once brought him joy, hiding any part of himself that might provoke criticism. But suppressing these parts of himself did not bring him closer to acceptance. Instead, he felt hollow, as though he were slowly erasing his own existence in a futile attempt to become someone his family could love. The sense of rejection followed him everywhere, casting a shadow over his interactions at school, in his neighborhood, and even in his own home. He felt like a ghost, drifting through his life unnoticed, his presence barely acknowledged unless someone was criticizing or mocking him. His world became increasingly small, narrowed to the spaces where he could be alone, where he didn't have to face the constant reminders of his flaws and his differences. Ethan's young mind could not fully understand why he was treated this way, but he internalized the rejection, the sense that he was inherently wrong. He became haunted by a growing resentment, a quiet anger that simmered beneath his shy, unassuming exterior. He spent more time alone, retreating into his own thoughts, his imagination turning darker as he grappled with the feeling of betrayal and the hopelessness of ever being accepted for who he was. In those private moments, Ethan would sit by himself, wondering why his family could not see the person he was, why they could not love him the way he needed to be loved. He began to feel as though he were trapped, not only in a body and identity that his family could not accept, but in a life where he was invisible, unloved, and constantly punished simply for existing as he was. These thoughts, swirling in the mind of a lonely, misunderstood child, grew darker, shaping his perception of the world and the people around him. He started to see his family not as a source of love or protection, but as a barrier to his happiness, a force that made him feel small, inadequate, and unworthy of love. In the depths of his solitude, Ethan's innocent longing for acceptance had twisted into something unrecognizable, his pain hardening into a cold resolve that he could barely understand himself. This quiet rage would lay dormant, simmering under layers of loneliness and shame, until the day when it would finally erupt, changing the course of his life and his family's forever. As Ethan grew older, the quiet differences that had once made him unique became marks of vulnerability, drawing the relentless attention of his peers and family alike. His interests, mannerisms, and the soft-spoken demeanor that once felt natural to him now seemed to invite mockery and criticism from nearly everyone around him. Each day felt like a test he was doomed to fail, with every interaction reinforcing his status as an outsider. The world, which he had once approached with curiosity and innocence, now felt like a hostile place, a maze of accusations, disappointment, and cruelty from which he had no escape. At school, Ethan became an easy target for his classmates. Children can be ruthlessly perceptive, quickly identifying anything that sets someone apart, and Ethan's shyness and sensitivity were precisely the qualities that made him stand out. He didn't play the rough games the other boys enjoyed, and his interests in drawing, reading, and quiet activities left him isolated during recess and lunch. His classmates taunted him, calling him names and using slurs they barely understood but knew were meant to hurt. They would jeer at his gentleness, pushing and prodding until they got a reaction. If Ethan cried or showed any sign of emotion, it only fueled their cruelty. The moments he spent alone, hiding in a corner or under the playground slide, were his only refuge from the relentless bullying. Teachers, either overwhelmed or indifferent, failed to notice the signs of Ethan's distress. They dismissed the teasing as harmless play, ignoring the subtle power dynamics at play and the depth of Ethan's suffering. If he ever gathered the courage to tell them what was happening, he was often met with responses that downplayed his pain. "You need to toughen up, Ethan," they would say, or ignore them, they'll stop eventually. But the bullying didn't stop, and his classmates sensed his vulnerability and capitalized on it, knowing he had no support from adults who might protect him. Over time, Ethan stopped trying to reach out for help. He felt invisible, as though the world itself had turned its back on him. At home, the rejection and alienation Ethan experienced only intensified. His family, who should have been his support and source of comfort, became yet another front in the war against his sense of self. His father's disappointment had deepened into disdain, his patience thinning as Ethan continued to resist fitting into the mold his family had set for him. Michael's subtle criticisms turned into open hostility, his frustration boiling over into harsh words and occasional punishments. He saw Ethan's sensitivity as a form of weakness, something to be disciplined out of him, and he began to believe that he could correct his son's behavior with enough strictness. Whenever Ethan displayed traits that his father deemed soft or unmanly, Michael would respond with stern lectures, reminding Ethan of the expectations he was failing to meet. He would speak in a voice dripping with contempt, his words laced with disappointment as he told Ethan he needed to act like a real boy and toughen up. Each word struck Ethan like a blow, leaving him feeling small and ashamed. His father's disapproval became a constant presence in his life, a weight he carried with him wherever he went, eroding his sense of worth. Over time, Ethan came to associate his father's love with conformity, believing that he would only be accepted if he buried the parts of himself that felt most authentic. Ethan's siblings, too, became complicit in his rejection. They had picked up on their father's disappointment and absorbed his disdainful attitude toward Ethan's differences. His older brother and sister would join in mocking him, mimicking his voice or teasing him about his interests in front of their parents, confident that they would be met with laughter or silent approval rather than reprimand. They saw Ethan's gentle nature as something worthy of derision, a flaw that deserved ridicule rather than understanding. For them, he was a source of amusement, a target for their own frustrations and insecurities, someone they could safely belittle without fear of consequence. Ethan's mother, who might have been a source of comfort, was too passive to intervene. She saw the cruelty her son faced but chose to remain silent, hoping that he would eventually grow out of it. She viewed Ethan's sensitivity as a phase, a quirk that would fade with time, and was reluctant to disrupt the family's fragile peace by defending him. Whenever he came to her after a particularly harsh encounter with his father or siblings, she would offer him only fleeting sympathy. Brushing his hair or giving him a brief hug before telling him to try harder or be strong, Ethan began to feel that even his mother's love was conditional, dependent on his ability to conform to her expectations. Her reluctance to protect him left him feeling even more alone, as though he had no ally, no safe haven, even in his own home. As the months turned into years, Ethan's isolation deepened. The few joys he had once found drawing, reading, and imagining a kinder world began to fade as he retreated further into himself. He stopped sharing his interests with anyone, hiding his drawings and books as though they were shameful secrets rather than sources of comfort. He learned to keep his head down, to stay quiet, and to avoid attracting attention. But even his silence did not save him from the relentless taunts of his classmates or the disdain of his family. Every interaction became a reminder of his perceived inadequacies, a testament to his failure to live up to the world's expectations. Ethan's sense of self began to erode, replaced by a growing numbness that took root in his heart. He felt as though he were disappearing bit by bit, each rejection carving away at him, until there was nothing left but a shell of the child he had once been. He spent hours alone in his room, staring at the walls, feeling the weight of his own loneliness pressing down on him. His thoughts turned inward, dark and quiet, a refuge where he could retreat from the judgmental eyes of the world. In his mind, he began to build a fortress, a place where he could hide the parts of himself that others found unacceptable, a place where he was safe from the ridicule and rejection that seemed to follow him everywhere. But the isolation that protected him also hardened him. The fortress he built in his mind became a prison, trapping him within his own bitterness and resentment. He felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to love him, abandoned by a family that saw him as an embarrassment rather than a son. Each day his anger grew, simmering beneath the surface, feeding on the neglect and cruelty he endured. He began to see his family not as people who loved him, but as oppressors, barriers to his happiness and acceptance. By the time he turned 9, Ethan had become a ghost in his own life. He moved through his days in a fog, his eyes downcast, his voice barely a whisper, his presence almost invisible. His classmates continued to mock him, sensing the growing vulnerability that made him an even easier target. At home, his family's indifference deepened, their occasional acts of cruelty feeling like routine rather than malice. Ethan's world had become one of silence and shadows, a place where he existed only on the periphery, watching as others lived lives filled with laughter, connection, and love, things he had come to believe he would never experience. The isolation that surrounded him became suffocating, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. Ethan began to feel trapped, as though his life were a maze with no exit, a series of walls that closed in around him, leaving him nowhere to turn. The loneliness that had once been a quiet ache now became a consuming emptiness, a void that threatened to swallow him whole. He spent long nights lying awake, his mind filled with thoughts he could barely understand, a mix of anger, sorrow, and longing that twisted inside him like a storm. In the depths of his solitude, Ethan's anger began to take on a new shape. It was no longer a passive resentment, a quiet bitterness. It became something darker, more focused. He started to think about the people who had hurt him, the family members who had rejected him, the classmates who had mocked him, and he felt a cold resolve settle over him. He knew that he could never escape the pain they caused him, that he would never find peace as long as they were in his life. His mind began to turn toward thoughts of revenge, a way to end his suffering, to break free from the prison they had built around him. Ethan's once innocent heart had become a well of bitterness, a darkness that grew deeper with each act of rejection and cruelty. He no longer dreamed of acceptance or love, he dreamed only of escape, of a world where he was free from the people who had made him feel small, unworthy, and invisible. By the time Ethan reached his 10th year, the world he lived in had become something he barely recognized, a place where every glance, every word seemed laced with judgment and cruelty. In his young mind, he struggled to understand why he was so disliked, why the people who should have loved him, the people he once trusted, treated him with scorn or indifference. In the beginning, he had blamed himself, convinced that there was something wrong with him, some flaw that made him unworthy of kindness. But over time, that self-blame had twisted into something else: resentment, anger, and a growing conviction that his suffering was inflicted on him by others. Ethan's anger began as a quiet, nagging feeling that he tried to ignore, pushing it down into the depths of his mind. But no matter how hard he tried to bury it, the anger was always there, simmering beneath the surface. Each time he endured another harsh word from his father or a mocking laugh from his siblings, that anger grew a little stronger. It was like a smoldering fire, faint but relentless, feeding on every slight, every insult, every moment of rejection. Ethan's anger became his silent companion, the only constant presence in his life, a strange comfort in a world where he felt so utterly alone. As his anger grew, Ethan found himself retreating further into his mind, finding solace in daydreams and fantasies. But these were not the innocent fantasies of a young child. They were dark and vengeful, filled with images of retribution against those who had made his life so painful. In these imagined scenarios, he was no longer small and powerless. He was strong, decisive, capable of inflicting the same pain he had endured. Ethan's daydreams became elaborate, detailed, a way for him to regain a sense of control over a life that felt beyond his grasp. He would sit alone in his room, staring at the walls, his mind drifting into these fantasies with a calm detachment. In his imagination, he was able to silence his father's angry voice, to end his siblings' taunts, to erase the judgmental eyes of his classmates. In his mind, he could create a world where he was free from their cruelty, a world where he was no longer forced to shrink into himself to avoid their scorn. He began to relish these thoughts, finding a strange peace in them, a respite from the constant pressure of trying to conform to a life he could never truly accept. Ethan's fantasies grew darker as the weeks passed, evolving from vague thoughts of escape to intricate plans of revenge. He began to imagine specific moments, reliving the worst instances of bullying and rejection, and in his mind he would rewrite them, turning the tables on those who had hurt him. His classmates, who laughed at his quiet voice and gentle mannerisms, became targets in his mind, each one a villain in the twisted story he created to make sense of his pain. His family members, who had turned their backs on him, became figures of resentment, symbols of the confinement and loneliness he felt every day. Each night as he lay in bed, these thoughts would return, a cycle of bitterness and sorrow that filled his mind until he could hardly think of anything else. The darkness in his heart felt like a living thing, a creature that grew stronger each time he remembered a cruel word or a stinging laugh. Ethan stopped trying to fight these feelings. He let them consume him, finding solace in the anger and the power he felt in these imagined moments of vengeance. In his mind, he had control, he had strength, and he was no longer the helpless, invisible child that the world saw. Over time, the line between fantasy and reality began to blur. Ethan's daydreams no longer felt like harmless thoughts. They began to feel like something more concrete, a plan, a possibility. He would sit in silence, imagining himself carrying out the revenge he had dreamed of, and he felt a sense of satisfaction, a release from the bitterness that had taken root in his soul. The more he thought about it, the more real it felt, as though he could reach out and touch this dark future he had created in his mind. It was a strange and frightening feeling, but at the same time it was exhilarating, a glimpse of freedom in a world that had offered him nothing but pain. Ethan's behavior began to change as he embraced these dark thoughts. He became colder, more withdrawn, his once shy demeanor replaced by a blank, almost unreadable expression. He no longer cared about his family's disapproval or his classmates' taunts. Their words and actions seemed insignificant compared to the plans he held in his mind. To him, they were simply actors in a story that he was rewriting, characters who no longer had power over him. His indifference unnerved his family, who had grown accustomed to his sensitivity, his quiet attempts to gain their approval. Now, when they mocked or criticized him, he would stare back with a calm, almost chilling detachment, as though he saw something they couldn't understand. At school, his classmates noticed the change as well. The quiet, shy boy who had once flinched at their insults now seemed distant, unresponsive, as though he were no longer affected by their words. The bullies who had once taken pleasure in tormenting him began to lose interest, sensing that he no longer reacted, no longer gave them the satisfaction of seeing him hurt. But this new distance, this strange detachment, only fueled Ethan's resentment further. He saw their disinterest as yet another form of rejection, another way in which the world refused to see him, to acknowledge his pain. Ethan's mind became a dark place, a world he had built to protect himself from the rejection and loneliness that haunted him. His once innocent dreams had turned into something twisted, something that frightened even him at times, but he clung to these thoughts as a lifeline, a way to survive in a world that had given him nothing. His anger became his armor, his hatred a shield against the pain of his everyday life. In his mind, he was no longer a powerless child, he was a force, someone who could take control of his own destiny, who could finally make those who had hurt him feel the same pain he had endured for so long. As his fantasies grew darker, Ethan began to consider the logistics of his plans. He would sit in his room, thinking through the details, imagining every step, every movement. He knew his family's routines by heart, their habits, the times when the house was quiet and empty. He began to take note of small details, things he had never noticed before, as though he were preparing for something inevitable, something he could no longer turn away from. In his mind, it felt almost like a game, a puzzle he was piecing together, each thought bringing him closer to a sense of closure, of peace. The darkness that had grown within Ethan was no longer just an emotion, it was a purpose, a goal. He felt as though he had found something real, something that belonged to him alone, a plan that no one could take away. His isolation, his loneliness, his anger, they all became fuel for this plan, pieces of a puzzle that he could control. In his mind, he had created a new world, one where he was no longer at the mercy of others, where he was no longer the victim of their cruelty. He found a strange satisfaction in this thought, a sense of freedom that he had never known. But beneath the surface, there was still a small, frightened part of him, a piece of the child he had once been, a child who had only wanted to be loved and accepted. This part of him was terrified of the darkness he had embraced, of the plans he had made in his mind. He felt a deep, aching sorrow for the life he had lost, for the innocence that had been stolen from him. But each time this sorrow threatened to break through, he would push it down, burying it beneath layers of anger and bitterness, telling himself that he didn't need love, that he didn't need acceptance. In the world he had created in his mind, he was alone. And that was enough. Ethan's growing darkness became his identity, a shield against the pain that had once consumed him. He no longer feared the judgment of others, no longer sought the approval of his family. He was free in a way he had never been before, unbound by the expectations and limitations that had once defined his life. The child he had been was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, a person who could face the world with a calm detachment, a person who no longer cared about the love he would never receive. As Ethan's resentment deepened, his thoughts began to crystallize into a single, inescapable idea: he would have to escape. But for him, escape meant more than running away. It meant finding a way to end his suffering once and for all, removing those he felt had trapped him in a life of pain. In his mind, the world around him had become a cage, the people in it the bars that kept him from freedom. Slowly, methodically, he began to turn his fantasies into something concrete, a plan that would sever him from the life he despised and the people he held responsible for his torment. The planning became an obsession, a ritual he performed in the quiet of his room, going over each detail in his mind until it was flawless. Ethan knew his family's routines by heart. He knew when his father rose each morning, when his mother went to bed, and when his siblings were most distracted. He used this knowledge like pieces of a puzzle, constructing a mental map of the house that would allow him to move undetected, to carry out his plan with precision. Each detail mattered, each step carefully considered and rehearsed in his mind. He felt a sense of power in this secret preparation, a mastery over the life that had always felt beyond his control. In the days leading up to the night he'd chosen, Ethan began to practice his movements. Under the cover of darkness, he would slip out of bed, walking silently through the house, testing the floorboards for creaks, memorizing the quietest paths from room to room. He learned to breathe slowly, to calm his heart, to let himself blend into the shadows. Each practice run brought him closer to his goal, and each successful movement made him feel stronger, more capable. He no longer saw himself as a victim, but as someone who could take control, someone who could end his suffering through his own calculated actions. Ethan's preparations extended beyond his movements. He carefully selected the tools he would need. From the kitchen, he took note of the knives, choosing one that felt solid and balanced in his hand. When his parents weren't around, he practiced holding it, feeling its weight, imagining how it would feel to finally wield it in defense of his own freedom. The blade became a symbol of his resolve, a silent reminder of the power he had been denied and was now ready to claim. He hid it in his room, tucked beneath loose floorboards, and would check on it each night, as though confirming that his escape was still within reach. As he continued his preparations, Ethan found himself becoming emotionally detached. He no longer felt the same pangs of guilt or fear that had once haunted him. Instead, he felt calm, his mind focused on the night he'd chosen and the careful steps he would take to bring it to life. His family's words, their scorn and disapproval, no longer reached him. They were just background noise, the final acts of people who would soon be gone from his life. He watched them with a strange detachment, seeing them less as family members and more as obstacles he had to overcome. When the chosen night finally arrived, Ethan's mind was a blank slate, free of doubt or hesitation. The house was dark and quiet, his family asleep in their beds, unaware of the storm gathering in the shadows. He lay in bed, eyes open, waiting for the sounds of slumber to settle over the house. Every detail he had practiced, every movement he had rehearsed, felt burned into his mind, ready to be executed with perfect precision. His heart beat steadily as he waited, feeling the weight of the blade hidden under the floor, the coolness of the night air against his skin. Slowly he rose from his bed, moving with the ease and calm of someone who had done this countless times before. He moved through the hallway, glancing briefly into his siblings' rooms, watching the gentle rise and fall of their chests as they slept. His mother's room was next, her door slightly ajar, revealing her silhouette against the moonlit window. For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind, a faint reminder of the family he had once yearned to belong to. But that flicker was quickly extinguished by the memory of every insult, every dismissal, every look of disappointment. In his father's room, he found the man who had cast the longest shadow over his life, the man whose harsh words and cold stares had left scars that no amount of time could heal. Ethan watched his father sleeping, feeling no fear, only a quiet, steady resolve. He had spent so many nights lying awake, tormented by this man's voice in his head, but now he felt only peace. The rage that had once consumed him had turned into something colder, something that allowed him to move without hesitation, without feeling. When the house was silent once more, Ethan returned to his room, gathering the few belongings he had packed. He felt no satisfaction, no relief, only a strange emptiness, a hollow feeling that came from the finality of his actions. The life he had known, the people who had shaped him through pain and rejection, were now gone. He had severed his ties to them, cut himself free from the cage they had built around him. He was free, yet he felt no joy, no triumph. Only a quiet, unsettling calm that settled over him like a shadow. With one last look at the house, Ethan slipped out into the night, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, yet leaving him feeling strangely light. The world outside was dark and silent, a void that stretched endlessly before him. He walked away from the life he had left behind, the family he had once called his own, feeling as though he were stepping into another world entirely. There was no one left to judge him, no one left to make him feel small, unworthy, or invisible. For the first time, he was truly alone. The night was thick with silence, the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred, wrapping the Mahoney home in a heavy, quiet shroud. The darkened house stood untouched, its inhabitants peacefully asleep, unaware of the shadows gathering in the corners. Ethan moved through the house with careful, measured steps, his face expressionless, his mind emptied of hesitation or fear. This was the night he had been preparing for, and every detail felt rehearsed, each step a familiar part of the plan that had simmered in his mind for so long. He slipped from his room, his small figure blending into the darkness, a mere shadow in the stillness of the night. His senses were heightened, every creak in the floor, every rustle of the old house settling, alerting him to his surroundings. The knife he had chosen lay heavy in his hand, Its cold steel a silent partner in the act he was about to commit. He felt its weight as a grounding force, something real and solid, a reminder that he was in control, that he held his own fate in his hands. Ethan's first stop was his parents' bedroom. He paused outside the door, listening to the steady rhythm of their breathing, feeling the familiar swell of resentment rise within him. Here were the people who had, for as long as he could remember, made him feel small, weak, and inadequate. In the dim light filtering through the window, he could see his father's face, peaceful in sleep, so unlike the stern, unforgiving expression Ethan had come to dread. His mother lay beside him, her features softened by the quiet of the night, her hand resting on the edge of the blanket, as if in a gesture of comfort. For a brief moment he felt a pang of doubt, a fleeting hesitation that whispered to him of the love he had once yearned for, the family he had once tried to please. But that whisper was quickly drowned out by the flood of memories, the sharp words, the dismissive looks, the countless times he had reached out for approval only to be met with cold indifference. They had shown him no mercy, and now he would return that indifference. He tightened his grip on the knife, steadying his breath, and in one fluid motion, he moved forward, carrying out the act that had consumed his thoughts for so long. The silence that followed was as thick as the night itself, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over him like a weight. His parents lay motionless, the room around them untouched, as though time itself had frozen in those brief, fateful moments. Ethan stared at them, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, only a hollow emptiness that filled him as he turned and moved on to the next room. His siblings' rooms were down the hall, their doors closed, their rooms darkened and quiet. He moved toward his older brother's door, remembering the taunts, the sneers, the way his brother had delighted in mocking him, in pointing out every flaw, every trait that set him apart. To his brother, Ethan had been nothing more than a target, someone to belittle and push down to feel stronger, more important. Standing over him now, Ethan felt a strange detachment, as though he were watching himself from a distance. The act itself was swift, final, a punctuation to years of torment. Finally, Ethan entered his sister's room, his last stop in the house that had once been his home. She lay curled under her blankets, her face peaceful, her breath steady and shallow. She was the youngest after him, someone who had joined in the laughter, the taunts, but had also sometimes shown a flicker of kindness. But even her moments of softness had been fleeting, conditional, tied to the approval of their parents and older brother. She had taken part in his alienation, become yet another voice in the chorus that had made him feel so alone. Ethan's movements were mechanical, efficient, each action unfolding as he had imagined it countless times. And then, once again, silence fell. When it was over, Ethan stood in the hallway, the house now quiet, filled with an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. The faces that had haunted him for years, the voices that had echoed in his mind, were now silent. He felt a strange lightness, a freedom that had never been his before, yet also an emptiness that gnawed at him, filling him with a strange, hollow ache. He had removed the chains that had bound him, cut himself free from the life that had caused him so much pain, but the weight of his actions now settled over him like a shroud, an inescapable reminder of the irrevocable path he had chosen. Ethan returned to his room, where he had stashed a small bag with a few belongings, ready for his departure. His hands felt numb, his body moving on autopilot as he gathered the essentials, his eyes glazed, his face blank. As he moved through the house one last time, he took in the familiar sights, the worn furniture, the framed photos on the wall, the small details of a life that was no longer his. He felt detached, as though he were floating above it all, watching himself from a distance. With a final look, he slipped out the front door, the cool night air hitting him like a wave as he stepped onto the porch. The sky was dark, the world around him silent, as though it were holding its breath. He walked away from the house, his footsteps soft, disappearing into the night without looking back. Behind him lay the remnants of a life he had severed, a past he could never return to. In his mind, he knew that he was free, yet the freedom felt hollow, shadowed by the weight of the silence he left behind. Ethan walked further into the darkness, leaving his home and family as he ventured into an uncertain future. The air around him was cool and still, the streets empty and quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil that churned within him. He had done the unthinkable, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In his mind, he had achieved what he had longed for, yet as he moved further away, a strange sense of loss settled over him, a faint echo of the life he had left behind. As dawn approached, the house lay undisturbed, cloaked in a peace that belied the tragedy within. The world around it would soon awaken, neighbors would begin their day, unaware of the events that had unfolded in the quiet of the night. But for Ethan, the life he had known was over, replaced by the path he had chosen, a path that would lead him far from the family he had left behind, yet never free from the memories that would haunt him forever. The following morning, an unsettling quiet settled over the Mahoney household. Neighbors going about their early routines began to notice the stillness, a strange silence where there should have been signs of life. The Mahoneys, known for their structured lives and strict routines, were not the type to sleep in. When the day wore on without a single light turning on or any movement seen, a feeling of unease began to ripple through the neighborhood. Finally, one concerned neighbor, uneasy with the stillness, called the local police, who arrived shortly thereafter to check on the family. As officers entered the Mahoney home, the horrific scene revealed itself. The silence within the house was now explained in the darkest terms. Room by room, they encountered what remained of the family, the tragic evidence of a meticulously executed act. The weight of the scene left even the seasoned officers in stunned silence. They moved through each room with a growing sense of dread, unable to understand how something so terrible could have happened within the walls of what had appeared to be a perfectly ordinary, respectable home. By mid-morning, the Mahoney residence had transformed into a crime scene, yellow tape cordoning off the property as police cars and emergency vehicles lined the street. Neighbors gathered in shocked clusters, speaking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the unthinkable tragedy that had unfolded among them. The Mahoneys had been well known in the community, regarded as strict but upstanding people who raised their children with firm values. No one could have imagined that such horror lay hidden behind the carefully maintained exterior of their home. As investigators began their work, details of the scene painted a chilling picture. The meticulous nature of the crime suggested that this was no random act of violence, no intrusion by an outsider. As they surveyed the scene, officers noted that one family member was conspicuously missing: Ethan, the Mahoney's youngest son. Initial reports circulated, speculating that he might have been taken or perhaps escaped the tragedy. But as the investigation deepened, their worst suspicions took form and Ethan became the primary suspect. It was an almost impossible realization for the community to process. How could a child, barely 10, be responsible for such a horrific act? The media descended upon the quiet neighborhood, turning the Mahoney home into a national headline. News outlets fixated on the tragic and disturbing story, searching for answers and piecing together the family's background, painting a picture of a troubled youth who had perhaps felt pushed too far. Reporters dredged up stories from Ethan's school, speaking to classmates and teachers who described him as a quiet, withdrawn boy who never quite fit in. They found stories of bullying, snippets of interactions that in hindsight took on a grim significance. Teachers, classmates, even neighbors speculated, their fragmented memories piecing together a narrative that fueled endless headlines and speculation. Within the community, the shock of the tragedy gave way to reflection and, for some, guilt. Neighbors who had once dismissed Ethan's quiet demeanor as shyness now wondered if they had missed signs of his pain. Those who had witnessed his alienation, who had seen him wandering alone during recess or sitting by himself on the school bus, now questioned whether they had turned a blind eye to the isolation that might have driven him to this point. Classmates and teachers, too, spoke in hindsight about the small signs they had overlooked: the quietness, the lingering sadness in his eyes. For a moment, the town grappled with the uncomfortable realization that they had perhaps played a role in creating the conditions that had led to this tragedy. Meanwhile, the search for Ethan spread beyond the borders of the town. Law enforcement agencies across the state issued alerts. His photographs circulated widely as the manhunt intensified. Officers questioned everyone who might have had contact with him, retraced his steps, hoping to find any trace of his whereabouts. His young face was plastered across news stations, a stark contrast to the horrific story they were telling. Public reactions were divided. Some viewers saw him as a tragic figure, a child who had snapped under the weight of his own pain, while others viewed him with fear and anger, horrified that someone so young could commit such a brutal act. But Ethan, familiar with the area and careful in his escape, had already managed to slip far from the community that was now reeling from his actions. Alone and hidden, he moved between secluded spots he had mapped out beforehand, blending into the background as he distanced himself from the life he had left behind. He felt neither relief nor regret, only a numbness that settled deep within him, insulating him from the enormity of what he had done. He carried only a small bag of essentials, a few belongings he had thought to take, though even these now felt like remnants of a life he could barely remember. As he traveled, a strange calm overtook him, a quiet acceptance of the path he had chosen. The fears that had once haunted him seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of detachment from the world around him. In the quiet moments, he felt the weight of his solitude pressing in on him, But it was a different kind of loneliness, a silence unbroken by taunts, judgments, or dismissive glances. For the first time, he was truly alone, free from the people who had once defined his every waking moment. Yet the freedom he had imagined brought no sense of peace, only an endless stretch of emptiness. Back in town, the Mahoney family tragedy left a permanent scar on the community. The empty house became a haunting reminder of the events, a place where neighbors would avert their eyes as they passed, unwilling to confront the reality of what had occurred. Over time, the townspeople settled into an uneasy silence, their conversations marked by cautious words, unspoken questions about the darker forces that might have been at play. Some people chose to remember the Mahoneys as victims, martyrs to the town's ideals, while others viewed the tragedy as a grim lesson, a reminder of what happens when pain and isolation are left unaddressed. The story of the Mahoney family slowly faded from national attention as new stories emerged to take its place. But for those closest to it, the memory lingered, a dark echo that could never be erased. Ethan's classmates, his teachers, his neighbors all carried a part of the story with them, a burden of memories and questions they would never fully resolve. Some of them clung to the belief that he had been a monster hiding in plain sight, while others wrestled with the possibility that he had been failed by those who should have protected him. As for Ethan, he continued to drift, a nameless figure moving through the world, haunted by the silence he had created. He remained hidden, blending into the background, avoiding eye contact, slipping between shadows. The life he had left behind was a memory, distant yet inescapable, a burden he carried with him as he walked farther and farther away. The freedom he had sought had become a hollow achievement, a journey that led him nowhere, leaving him forever bound to the darkness he had unleashed. The Mahoney house remained empty, its walls bearing silent witness to the events that had unfolded within. Over time, the town moved on, but the tragedy had left its mark, a permanent shadow that settled over the quiet streets and careful facades. Though years would pass, the memory of that night would linger, a reminder of the pain that can grow unseen, the loneliness that can fester behind closed doors, and the unthinkable consequences that can arise when a heart is left to break in silence.